Chapter 31, Section 4 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part II. The Student's Roman Empire, Part II, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 31, Roman Life and Manners. Section 4, The Aqueducts, the Baths. During the last 3 centuries of the Republic and under the Empire, Rome obtained her supply of water from the surrounding hills by means of aqueducts, some of which have been mentioned in the foregoing pages. When Frontinus wrote his treatise on the aqueducts of the city of Rome, there were 9 aqueducts, of which 4 dated from the Republican period. 1. Aqua Appia, begun by Appius Claudius, the censor, B.C. 312. 2. Anio Vetus, derived from the river Anio, begun by M. Quirinus Dentatus, censor in B.C. 272. 3. Aqua Marcia, built by the praetor Q. Marcius Rex in B.C. 144. 4. Aqua Tepula, built by the censors Servilius Capio and Cassius Longinus, B.C. 127, and so called because its water had a slightly warm temperature. The courses of the Aqua Appia, the Anio Vetus, and the Aqua Marcia were almost entirely underground. The Aqua Marcia, which began south of the Via Valeria, at a distance of 36 miles from Rome, supplied the coldest and purest water of all. There are still remains of it to be seen near Tivoli. It was repaired by Agrippa, and Augustus reinforced its supply from a new spring, which he connected with it by the Aqua Augusta. The 2 new aqueducts of Agrippa, 33 B.C., 5. Aqua Julia, and 6. Aqua Virgo, have been mentioned in an earlier chapter. The Aqua Julia came from a source 2 miles to the right of the 12th milestone in the Via Latina. It joined the Aqua Tempula, and afterwards both joined the Aqua Marcia, so that the 3 channels traveled for some distance, one above the other, on the same substructions, and entered Rome on an arch, now the Porta San Lorenzo, erected by Augustus in 5 B.C. The Aqua Virgo, renowned like the Marcia for the purity of its water, was designed to supply the baths of Agrippa. 7. The Aqua Alsietina, derived from the Lacus Alsietinus, was on the other side of the Tiber. The water was remarkably bad, and was probably intended for the Naumachia, the basin which Augustus made for sham sea fights. 8. The Aqua Claudia, and 9. The Anio Novus, were begun by Gaius and finished by Claudius 52 A.D. The length of the former, which began near the 38th milestone on the Via Subalensis, was between 40 and 50 miles, and about a third of it was above ground, resting on arches and substructions. The Anio Novus, which began a few miles further on the same road, was still longer, nearly 60 miles, and higher, but less of it was above ground. These 2 aqueducts joined near the city, where they entered one above the other. Of the Claudian aqueduct, whose arches still remain in the Capagna, the elder Pliny wrote thus, "If any one will carefully calculate the quantity of the public supply of water for baths, reservoirs, houses, trenches, gardens, and suburban villas, and, along the distance which it traverses, the arches built, the mountains perforated, the valleys leveled, he will confess that never was anything more wonderful in the whole world." It has been estimated that the water supplied by these 9 aqueducts was "equal to that carried down by a river, 30 feet broad by 6 deep, flowing at the rate of 30 inches a second," and that if the population of Rome was 1,000,000, the supply was equivalent to 332 gallons a head daily. To these aqueducts Trajan added a 10th, the Aqua Trajana. It is interesting to observe that some of the ancient aqueducts still supply Rome with water, namely the Aqua Virgo, still called by the same name, Aqua Virgine, restored by Pope Pius IV; the Aqua Paola, named after Pope Paul V, who constructed it by uniting the Aqua Trajana and the Aqua Alsietina; and the Aqua Marcia Pia, restored in 1870. Splendid aqueducts were built also in other parts of the Empire, and perhaps the finest remains of these achievements of Roman engineering are to be found at Segovia in Spain and at Nemausus. the Pont du Gard. The channel, specius, through which the water flowed had a slight slope. It consisted of stone or brick lined with cement, and was provided with vent holes. Sometimes the water did not pass through the specius itself, but through pipes, fistulae, of pottery or lead laid along inside the specius. At the source of the aqueduct there was a large reservoir, piscina; and other reservoirs were placed at stages along the course. When the water reached the city it flowed into a large chamber, from which it was conducted into 3 smaller basins, the middle one of these being filled from the overflow of the other 2. The 2 outer basins supplied private houses and the public baths; the middle one, the public fountains and ponds; so that in the case of a deficiency in the supply, the most useful purposes were first satisfied. These reservoirs formed what was called the chief castellum, and were usually contained in a handsome building. From the chief castellum the water was diverted into lesser local castella, distributed over the regions of the city. The castella were either public or private. The former supplied the circus and amphitheatres, the public fountains, the baths, and the praetorian camp. The private castella were built at the joint cost of the families who used them, but were under the supervision of the public officers who controlled the aqueducts, curatores aquarum. The water was measured by the size of the tube, calix, through which it passed out of the castellum. A very large number of officials were employed in managing the water supply, in keeping the aqueducts in repair, and in preventing fraudulent diversion of the water. The curatores aquarum had 460 slaves under them in the time of Frontinus. They were divided according to their duties as follows: 1. The vilici, who managed the pipes and the tubes; 2. The castellari, who had charge of the castella; 3. The circutores, who went around and inspected the aqueducts; 4. The silicari, who took up the pavement and laid it down again when subterranean pipes had to be examined; 5. The tectores, who attended to the masonry. This will give an idea of the elaborate organization which the Emperors developed for the supply of the city with water. Baths. In early times the Romans made use of the bath only for health or cleanliness. They washed their arms and legs once a day, and their whole body every week. But in later times bathing came to be regarded, not merely as a necessity, but as a luxury, and in the imperial period was a conspicuous feature of Roman life. At first, public baths were only intended for the use of poor people of low rank, who were unable to have the luxury of a bathroom at home; but before the end of the Republic, people of all classes resorted to the balneae, and the Emperors themselves used to bathe in public with their fellow citizens. The bath was a very cheap luxury, which the poorest men could indulge in, as the fee was only a quadrans, the smallest Roman coin. Women had probably to pay a higher price. The usual time for bathing was about the 8th hour, before the chief meal of the day; but idle and luxurious people often bathed several times a day. Gourmands used to take a bath after eating as well as before, in order to get a fresh appetite. This practice is ascribed for instance to Caligula and to Nero, and a contemporary writer, Pliny the Elder, considered it partly the cause of the degeneration of morality. It was an ordinary practice in the time of Cicero to take emetics for the same purpose. The number of public baths, some built by the state, others by private speculators, was enormous. Agrippa is said to have added 170 to those already in existence. By the beginning of the 4th century their number was nearly 1,000. The bathing did not consist merely of a hot or cold bath, but was a long process, somewhat like that of our Turkish baths, only more elaborate. Hot air was employed as well as water. The chief rooms of a bath were the apoditerium or stripping room, in which the bathers took off their garments and committed them to slaves, who were proverbial for their dishonesty; the eleothesium or oil room, where the unguents were kept; the frigidarium or cold room, for those who only wished for cold baths; the tepidarium, a chamber heated by moderately warm air, in which the bather sat and was anointed before proceeding into the hot atmosphere of the caldarium. In some rich baths there was a special anointing room (unctorium). The caldarium was heated by a hypocaust, over which its floor was suspended. At one end of the room, in the old baths of Pompeii, was a bath of warm water, at the other end a tub of cold water, which was poured over the head before leaving the room. In some baths there was a sweating chamber of higher temperature, known as the laconicum, which was a round room with a domed ceiling. When he had duly perspired, the bather was scraped all over with a strigil, a sharp instrument of bone or metal, whose edge was softened with oil. The rich man was scraped by his slaves, whom he brought with him for the purpose; the poor man scraped himself. It was a disagreeable experience for fastidious people to bathe at the same time as those who used rank smelling oil. After anointing, the bathers remained some time in the tepidarium, so as not to pass suddenly into the cold air. This general description applies both to the ordinary baths (balneae) and to the special kind of baths called thermae, which were introduced by Agrippa, and formed a feature of imperial Rome. Baths were only a part of the thermae, which were really a Roman adaptation of a Greek gymnasium. In the period with which we are concerned, 4 great thermae were erected at Rome, those of Agrippa, Nero, Titus, and Trajan. These were extensive and splendid establishments, fitted up with conveniences for every exercise and pursuit. Here the youth of Rome could learn and practise athletics; here there were cool colonnaded halls (exedrae), where the idler could lounge and talk, where the philosophers could lecture, and the poets recite their verses. It was usual for clients to escort their patrons to the public baths, and these large crowds of shabby and dirty retainers were a nuisance to others. At the balneae (not in the thermae) there were separate sets of baths for women. A story is told of a consul's wife, who wished to bathe in the men's baths at Teanum in Campania, and an order was consequently issued that all the men should be turned out. The men's establishment was probably better provided with conveniences than the women's. But although there were separate departments, it was a common practice in the imperial age for men and women to bathe promiscuously in the same baths. Respectable women, of course, did not do so, but the habit was so widespread that both Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius had to make attempts to check the scandal. Rich men had private baths (balneae) in their own houses, though they used to frequent the public baths also. Juvenal mentions 600,000 sesterces (4,800 £) as a large price for building a set of bathrooms. The baths of Fronto cost more than half that sum (2,800 £). CHAPTER 31.